And that helped us figure out what those services are by thinking about who's our client, what do they need? People come to me basically when they want to get out of a franchise, fraud's been committed, or they got terminated.
I'm sure you have some juicy stories to tell. Welcome to the Franchise Empire Show. They say Rome wasn't built in a day, and building your empire doesn't happen overnight. My name is Tarek Johnson, and owning franchises is what helped me go from employee to employer and start building my empire for my family. So this podcast is for you, the empire builders. For those of you who want to build something that stands the test of time. This is for those of you who are crazy enough to believe that you can make the dream in your head come to life. This podcast is all about bringing you real people who are building real empires so you can get inside their mind and heart and get proven strategies and actionable insights that will catapult you to build, grow, and scale your empire. So ask any entrepreneur, and one piece of advice that they'll give you is to have a good accountant and a good lawyer. Buying a franchise is unique where you have this massive legal document called an FDD that you need to sign, and it's typically pretty one-sided. So in this episode, I sat down with Doug Luther, who is business partners with Nancy Leonard and a dispute resolution and litigation attorney for franchisees. So in simple terms, he helps franchisees resolve issues with franchisors, whether that's getting out of their franchise agreements and potentially getting some money back, or even suing the franchisor. So Doug and I talked about what are the most common reasons that franchisees are coming to him and how you can avoid a stressful legal situation and avoid buying the wrong franchise that you may regret. And we also talk about how do you handle it when you have a situation with a franchisor that you need to get resolved and you may need to get an attorney involved. This is really a must watch. Now, if you want to buy a franchise in the next 12 months, you should check out my brand new free franchise masterclass at franchiseempire.com. And if you want to work with me and my team on finding or buying a franchise or resale business, then you can go to tarekjohnson.com/consulting, and we're happy to see if we can help. With that said, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. All right, everyone. Well, welcome to another episode of the Franchise Empire Show. I'm here with Doug Luther. Doug, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, this is going to be a fun conversation. So you recently partnered and combined firms with Nancy Leonard, who has one of the most watched podcast episodes when we were running the Zero to Profitable Franchise podcast. I never would have imagined that the thing would take off and get over 10,000 views talking to an attorney about legal stuff. Because typically, I don't know, people would maybe find that stuff boring, but obviously not. So excited to talk to you.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, and I know that struck a chord because we have a lot of people who reach out to us and say they've watched it and that's why they've come to our firm.
Yeah. So what was the reasoning? Because you had your own firm, Nancy had her own firm. So why join forces, and how did you guys get connected to each other?
Yeah, well, I had started my firm after being a general counsel at a franchisor. So I had, about a little over a decade of experience, decided to go out, start a firm. I felt like there was a need especially on the West Coast, for a firm that focused on the franchisee side. And then, learned that Nancy was looking for somebody to kind of merge the firms with and kind of lead the firm, into the next chapter. And so it was just complementary to my firm. I mean, her firm was East Coast, mine was West Coast. Mine was more dispute litigation focused. Hers was transactional focused. And she had a bunch of attorneys on her team, who really understood franchising. And so it seemed like just a natural sync. Nancy and I had conversations, got along really well. We realized the personalities meshed, which is always important with that kind of situation. And it just seemed like the right direction to go.
Yeah, that seems like it flowed perfectly. And it's funny because I tell people, like, Nancy does not mess around. She's like a pit bull. She knows her stuff, and she's pretty aggressive in the process. And overall, you seem pretty laid back in the interactions that I've had with you. So I guess that's where it's kind of a good yin and a yang in a sense. I'm sure you're aggressive in helping your clients, but it seems like you're pretty laid back overall.
Yeah. And I think we've got kind of, we've got a good mix. Like, I'm pretty, laid back with things. Certainly unless I'm, in the heart of litigation or something, I got to turn that switch on. But I think we're a good mix, and it's great having her on the firm because she just has decades of experience in this space, and so she's seen everything, and really anytime I have a question or someone in the firm has a question, she's there to kind of help us out. So she's a real benefit to the firm.
Yeah. And so what was the difference of really what you guys were focused on prior to joining and who you helped?
Yeah, and I had a couple when I had started my firm. I kind of had more a broad clientele. I had franchisors as clients, and we were helping them franchise their business. And then when we combined with Nancy's firm, made the decision. Okay, we're getting bigger. We just need to focus on the franchisee side. One, to avoid conflicts, but two, just because over time you're representing those people, you're pushing legal arguments that's going to benefit franchisees as a whole. And so it just made sense to kind of commit in that one direction. So that was one of the big kind of changes I made at my firm is we had a number of franchisor clients that I said, sorry, we're going to have to send you elsewhere, so we could focus on the other side.
Yeah. And so what is your specialty compared to like what Nancy and her team, I guess now you guys' team do?
Yeah, so Nancy, transactional attorney, focuses on the doing basically the transactional side, so reviewing franchise disclosure documents and franchise agreements for clients, doing the commercial lease negotiations, and then once that franchisee is done well enough, either to sell it or to buy additional units. And so those are kind of our transactional practice line. My side is all on the dispute litigation side. So I started up as a business litigator at a large firm, went to a boutique firm doing franchise litigation. And so, although I have some transactional background, having been in house at a franchisor and leading their legal team, most of my background is in dispute resolution. And people come to me basically when they want to get out of a franchise, or they think fraud's been committed, or they got terminated, or they're not allowing a transfer. And so we're going into those situations and trying to resolve it, before it hits litigation, and if in litigation if need be.
Very interesting. So I'm sure you have some juicy stories to tell.
Definitely.
Yeah, I love the fact that you guys have, really focused on now kind of just being franchisee focused. I mean, you mentioned the potential conflicts of interest, and it's hard balancing, being an entrepreneur, wanting to provide for your family, your employees, and your team, and that there are opportunities to help clients, right? And could be a franchisor client. It's hard to say no when you have to put food on the table and you can legitimately help to really like hone in and focus. Was that hard for you? Because I think people can relate that are watching that are just entrepreneurs where they may need to make a similar decision in their business about narrowing down, refocusing, letting things go. So was that a hard decision for you or not really?
I think that's a good point. I mean, I think it is hard in the sense that it's always hard to turn away a potential client, right? And say, no, take your money elsewhere, not don't give it to me. And so I think that was a difficult thing for me. And that's probably why I initially started with some franchisor clients. I think there's always pros and cons to going to niching down or broadening your practice. But we felt that the franchisee side, that there really was a need, just not only in California and the West Coast, but also just across the country for a law firm. Yeah, and there's a couple other great law firms out there that work with franchisees, but we felt like there was a need for another firm that really focused on that area, and that was where the demand was, that was where the need was, and that if we kind of niched down and focused on that, we could really help that client base, and also just focus on the problems that they're facing, and put all our services at the firm that revolve around kind of the issues that franchisees face. And that helped us figure out what those services are by thinking about who's our client, what do they need.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And there's over 600,000 franchisees out there as well. So it's definitely has I guess, a bigger market potential. So so you do dispute resolution. Let's start at the top. Like, what are some of the most common reasons why franchisees are coming to you? Like, what are the issues that they're facing with these franchisors? My intention with this podcast is to help you build your empire. If you've gotten a single piece of value, one of the best ways you can help me and the podcast is to simply press the like button on YouTube. Lastly, share this podcast. Share it with someone who you know who is an empire builder. Imagine the impact you can have by helping them learn something that can build their business and empire. People will associate the value they got from this information from you, the person that shared it with them, all because you shared it with them. I appreciate you and your support. Let's get back to the episode.
Yeah. With inflation the last couple of years being what it is and being so high, that's really caused a change in the costs it might require to open a franchise. And what we've seen the last few years is in the franchise disclosure document, there's an item called item 7. That's the startup cost, what you would expect to pay to get your franchise up and operating in your first 3 months generally. And those numbers, a lot of times franchisors would just kind of keep the same numbers year over year. They wouldn't necessarily update them. The franchisor attorneys will send the FDD to their client and say, "Hey, any updates?" And they say, "No, we're good." And so, I think that led to kind of some complacency. And what happened the last couple of years is we've had lots of inflation, and so now clients have come to me over, especially over the last year. This is the number one issue we've seen. If they said, "Hey, it said it was 300 to 500,000 to open this business." But I'm getting estimates from contractors. I'm talking to people that just opened, and it's really now like 800,000. And we've had people double the high end of the range. We've had people 50% or more over the high end of the range, and so that creates a mountain of problems for franchisees when they're really just don't know exactly how much it's going to cost to open that business.
Wow, yeah, that can be a game changer because some folks may just be kind of getting in by the skin of their teeth in terms of what they may be able to qualify for, or having the 20% down payment for SBA, and they just may legitimately not financially be able to even open a business at that higher price point. So I want to talk about how people can prevent that in a second, because I feel like it potentially could be pretty simple to avoid that. So obviously there may have been a little bit of a lack of due diligence on the front end, but what happens when they are in those situations? So what is that conversation with franchisees? Does that even look like? Do they even have any recourse at that point?
Yeah, they do. I mean, because under the Federal Trade Commission's franchise rule, franchisors are required to provide basically accurate and reasonable estimates of what those startup costs are. So we've definitely had situations where clients have got in, they haven't opened the franchise, but they're kind of in that early period where they've signed the franchise agreement, they paid the initial fees, they start to look at a potential location. And it's usually the costs that are going significantly over are the build out costs. That's kind of the primary driver of costs going over the high end of the range. And so it's usually that person coming to us at that point and saying, "Gosh, I talked to a bunch of contractors. I got all these quotes, and it's going to come in way over what I thought it was. And I just, I don't want to go forward with this." And that's when we usually start negotiating with the franchisor an exit and trying to recoup a return of those initial franchise fees to allow that person to get out of the agreement.
Yeah, interesting. And so in the instances where, let's say, the franchisor, like they haven't they're in the middle of the year, so they haven't released their new FDD, which obviously the following year that's going to reflect in the FDD, and that will then be updated. But in that gap, I mean, do they have any sort of responsibility to the franchisees? Because they're knowing the build out costs are starting to come out high, and that it's not representative of what's in the FDD, because they're dealing with their franchisees who are having that challenge. They're probably hearing it outside of the FDD. Do they have any responsibility to communicate that verbally?
Well, they actually legally they have a responsibility to update that disclosure document on at least a quarterly basis if there's a material change to any information in there, and in a faster than quarterly basis in a lot of states like California. And so, arguably, if the numbers are off, they should be amending that FDD to update it to the latest numbers immediately once they understand, hey, it's really going higher than what we thought it was. Sometimes it's an issue of the left hand not talking to the right hand. The ops team might know that, and the real estate team might know that the costs are higher, but the legal team or the executive team, doesn't know, and so it's not getting communicated across the whole way until a year's run. But when there have been franchisors that we've seen that have updated their disclosure document 3 or 4 times in a year in the last couple of years because of that, to stay up to date with those costs.
Wow, interesting, interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that. So, and then like how I feel like with if you do the right franchisee validation up front, do you feel like that's something that people should be able to, you know, identify before they sign their agreement? Or like what are your thoughts on that? Is there typically like a lack of due diligence that occurred?
Yeah, I mean, I think the franchisor is typically in a place to have a better information on that, oftentimes, because they're typically collecting data from the franchisees on their business and those startup costs. But I think there's a lot of things franchisees could do to avoid that situation. I think talking with a lot of current franchisees is always key in any due diligence to buy a franchise. But I tell clients, hey, ask somebody who's just opened, what did you see? Did it come in over the item 7? How much did you spend on your build out? How much did you spend to get up and operating? Sometimes people are a little reluctant to disclose that, but oftentimes people are open books. And if you talk to enough current franchisees, you're going to find out information. And that's oftentimes what happens after the fact is they come to me and they're like, okay, I bought the franchise, I paid money, and then I started talking to people, and now I know it's a lot more expensive. And I mean, usually it's like, well, if you had done that a couple of months ago, you would have been in a better position.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I see it so often. We have folks that watch the YouTube channel. They'll same thing. They'll come to us or they'll come to us and say, "Hey, yeah, well, I'm getting ready to buy this franchise, and I just want to make sure that it's the right fit." And really, what they're looking for validation, from us to tell them that they a lot of times that they should do it. And it's like if that's what you're coming to us for, I'm sorry, we're gonna disappoint you because we're not gonna tell you that you should do anything if it doesn't make sense. But people they'll I'll ask how many franchisees have you talked to? We haven't talked to any. How in the world do you know that you want to buy that franchise if you have not talked to franchisees? That is one of the biggest benefits of buying a franchise is that you get to talk to other franchisees to figure out, does it even work? Is what the franchisor is selling you or presenting it, is it accurate? So what do you think? Why do you think that people don't wind up doing kind of having more of those conversations on the front end?
I think people get kind of caught up sometimes in the concept and entrepreneurship, which is great. Yay, you're excited, you want to get involved and you want to get into it, but I think sometimes you just got to pump the brakes a little bit and do that due diligence. And I think sometimes people just maybe they don't know that that's a critical step before you buy a business because it's their first. A lot of times it's the first business they've ever bought, first franchise they've ever bought, and so they haven't made a decision like this before. And so I think sometimes it's just something they don't know. And then sometimes it's just exuberance. They're too excited and they get into it. And then once they've bought it and cut the check, then they start looking, under the hood and finding out things they don't like.
Yeah, and there's this kind of newer wave of starting to do these group validation calls where maybe the franchisor is even present on the call or they step out into a different breakout room or they're having people listen to pre-recorded calls and they're not very clearly or transparently letting people know that, hey, you can talk to as many uh, franchisees as you want one on one. What are your thoughts of this new wave of franchisors? I get it, trying to simplify the process for franchisees because when I was a franchisee, at some point I just stopped returning the phone calls because it just gets too many and too overwhelming. Especially I was a couple of years in the franchise, you get people that are just kicking the tires, they're not serious, and at first I was generous, talking to people 45 minutes, an hour. After a while, it's like, all right, I'm just not calling people back anymore. So what's your opinion on those group validation calls and stuff like that?
Yeah, and I think it's the bigger problem I see there is kind of what we call steering, which is that the franchisor is steering a candidate toward a specific franchisee validation and not over, they're not doing their due diligence. And so we see that oftentimes, even when I talk to somebody who's buying a franchise, I say, have you, spoken with some franchisees? And they might say, yeah, I have. Where did you, how did you figure out who to speak with? Well, the franchisor gave me a list of, three or four and told me to call these ones. And the advice is, okay, that's great, but who's the franchisor going to choose in these group calls, in these lists that they give you? Oftentimes, it's the franchisees that they have done the best in the system, and those are important people to talk to too. But you also want to talk to people that you're not being steered toward. And so, the disclosure document in the franchise disclosure document has a list in the FDD of everyone in the system with their contact info, as well as a list of everyone who's left in the last year, or abandoned, or terminated, or closed. And so, I think it's good to talk to someone who's doing great, talk to someone who's doing okay, and talk to someone who did bad, did poorly and left the system, and get that full picture. Because a lot of times, even people that are, quote unquote, doing the due diligence might just be calling like the high performers, and you're not going to get a full picture that way.
Yeah. And, what I've seen, and this is where I feel like, the FDD has uniform standards, but then there's variability within that. So I've seen is that item 20? What is that? Item 20 or?
Yeah, so item 20, you've got the tables, and then they usually include the contact list as an exhibit later on in the disclosure document.
Yeah. So what I've seen is that, some franchisors where they list, the cell phone numbers to the owners, but some franchisors will list their store or location phone numbers, in which now it's very, very hard to actually get a hold of these franchisees. And then some of them I've seen some of them only list their email addresses. So what's the responsibility there? And I mean, yeah, what's the responsibility there? Because that's a little bit tricky where, I mean, if you tried to get me at my store, I just wasn't there. At one point, we were living in Florida, stores in California. You probably were not going to definitely get a call back. So how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. We looked at actually as a legal issue not too long ago, and we found that basically the franchisors really didn't have an obligation to have necessarily give you like the personal cell phone or the personal email. They could just give the store contact info, and that's all they were obligated to do. That being said, I think candidates can talk to the franchisor and say, hey, I'd really like to talk with so and so and so and so who live in my state and have opened to franchises. I see that it's just the store contact info. Can you provide me their personal contact info? That's one way to go about it. I think the other is if you're having a hard time getting a hold of any franchisee and the franchisor is loath to disclose that kind of contact info, to me, that's a little bit of a red flag. And so I would be cautious going into that franchise until you really had a chance to talk with a lot of franchisees.
Yeah, valid point. So outside of startup costs, like what are some of the other issues that you're seeing with franchisees and why they're coming to you?
I think we see a lot of kind of just not proven concepts. And so startup franchisors, so franchisors really kind of who just have a couple units or 10 units or 15 units, we see a lot of issues with those. And the reasons, there's a lot of reasons, but one of those is they don't really have a proof of concept necessarily yet, at least not nationally. They may have done well in one area of the country, but not others. Recently I had someone buy a franchise that was a window franchise, and it was a newer franchise, and it ended up not going well for them. And they said, well, the original location was in Florida, and they really focused on like hurricane grade windows and did really well on that. Well, those kind of windows aren't going to sell, in California or in Missouri. And so a lot of times these franchises that are startup, they may have a model that works in their geographical area, or they may have personal, kind of, made it work in their local, but it may not work in other parts of the country. And so those are a little bit more risky. And we see issues with that, where franchise systems don't work in other parts of the country.
Yeah, that is very interesting because the franchisors tend to want to put out that, hey, our system works and it works everywhere. And I think there's like a certain naivete to it, and almost like turning a blind eye, right? Which is like, no, yeah, the system works, and this like expectation that it's all on the franchisee sometimes. Do you see that?
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the podcast episode so far. One of the most consistent things that we hear from people that reach out to us is that buying a franchise feels really confusing. There's so many options out there. It's a scary decision. They don't know how to vet or do the due diligence or really narrow down on the right franchise for them. And then they really feel alone in the process. You might be the only one in your family who's ever pursued buying a franchise or being an entrepreneur. Or maybe you've tried to start a side hustle before, or other businesses like me. Like before franchising, I was not able to crack the code on entrepreneurship. I'd like to invite you to reach out and work with us. We've helped many clients buy franchises, get them profitable, or buy resale businesses that are thriving. Talking about highly profitable resales, great value. We've allowed many of our clients to actually quit their job right away and replace their income immediately. So if you want to work with me and my team on finding or buying a franchise, doing due diligence, vetting it, or resale, then go ahead and go to tarjohnson.com/consulting, and we're happy to see if we can help. All right, enjoy the rest of the episode.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the clients will say, "Hey, I can't get this to work. The business model doesn't work in my area." And all the franchisor tells me is to go work harder or go market more, But ultimately, the business model may not work in all, areas. And I think franchisors need to really think when they expand. Sometimes you see the systems that I'm most concerned about are systems where they only have one or two company-owned units, and then they go and sell 100, 200 franchises overnight. And there's a lot of potential issues there. Maybe it's a hot concept, obviously, if you're selling like that, but is it going to work across the country? Oftentimes I see that, and then 2 years later, I get calls from a ton of those franchisees saying, "Get me out of this."
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And then the emerging. Do you think that the emerging franchisor space is bigger now than it's ever been?
I think so, and especially when I'm on the franchisor side, I have kind of insight from having done some franchisor clients, and I'd have people call me who had never opened a location, and they're like, "Hey, I want to get ready to franchise," and I would just be like, "Well, have you tried it yourself to see if your business works first, so you can at least validate it, with prospective franchisees?" And I can tell you, oftentimes they don't. They might come up with they might franchise before they even have made it work once, or if they made it work once, they don't know. Being franchisor is a different business than being an operator of one location. And so that's also an issue we see with these guys is they need to scale themselves, just like any business. They've got to establish a support team. They've got to train franchisees. They've got to be there to go to their sites, to call them, to help them, to assist them. And just because you're a good operator of one location doesn't necessarily mean they have the ability to scale either to the franchisor level.
Yeah, it just really stresses the importance of due diligence, and sometimes it's really interesting because we have a lot of people that join our zero to profitable franchise program uh that we don't work with them in any sort of brokerage capacity. They're coming in, they're coming in for the due diligence, right? And so we're just supporting them and kind of that process. And I host a weekly group call with our clients where they can all learn from each other, and we have often people that are looking at a franchise system that has one or two franchisees, and I understand it when there are only a few competitors and pretty much all the territories are sold out, right, with like the bigger names that are proven. But oftentimes they're brands that there is a good amount of availability with other established franchise brands. So I what would you say to someone who's like, what piece of advice would you give to someone who's looking at an emerging franchisor, and like what would you caution them knowing like what it could look like on the other side of things?
Yeah, no, it's a risk. I mean, if me myself was buying a franchise, I don't know if I'd buy an emerging franchise brand, to be honest, because I talk with so many people every week who get into brands where they say the business doesn't work, the model doesn't work here, it's not profitable, I'm losing a ton of money. There's no way I can make this work. The marketing strategy they used over there doesn't work over here. And so I think when you're buying a startup franchise, emerging franchise system, it's a lot higher risk. It's not to say that it can't work out. It can. Certainly franchisors have to start somewhere, but it's a lot higher risk. And if you can find an established brand that has 50 or 100 plus units, and maybe that's in that sweet spot where they have a lot of units, but they're not fully developed, and they have a territory that works for you, I would definitely lean strongly toward that established brand because they have that proof of concept. And you can talk to the franchisees and see how well they're doing. If they're doing well, they like the system, there's a proof of concept in lots of different geographical areas. It makes it a lot less of a risky scenario for the franchisee.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, in terms of like just a rough percentage of the people that come to you, like what percentage do you think it is folks that are in a franchise system that has, let's say, less than 50 operating units versus folks coming to you where they're coming to you from a system that has like more than 50 operating units?
I'd say it's probably like at least two-thirds are probably coming from 50 and under, and especially where we see kind of fraud situations or where we would argue fraud, where they told me or put something in writing that something that later turned out to be false. Almost all those fraud situations are in that smaller franchise systems, the 0 to 50. And oftentimes too, that the other thing is they're not as sophisticated, right? So like the sales department might have a salesperson who's making up numbers, or they may not be providing accurate cost disclosures because they don't know what the costs are. We have see franchisors coming from the Midwest, and they're coming into California or New York, which are higher cost markets, and they don't know what the costs are, and they haven't done the due diligence, and so they give their numbers for opening something in Nebraska, which is not going to equate to the cost to open in California and New York. And so those smaller brands just aren't sophisticated, and so they haven't done their own due diligence in the sense of whether that business works, what are the costs, what are the different metrics in other parts of the country. And oftentimes too, on the restaurant side, which we see a lot of restaurant franchisors, they may not have the logistics set up. They may not have suppliers. They may not have an infrastructure in that part of the country where you can even get all the, things that you would normally sell in that system.
Yeah, that was something that I experienced as a franchisee. So we opened up our first one in California, and the franchisor, their headquarters was in California, and they had a pretty strong presence there. So our supply chain was pretty established there, and the supplier was covering a lot of stores. So when we moved to Florida, we bought an existing location with that franchisor, but there was only 3 or 4 stores total in Florida. We were the only one in our market. Even we were up in northern Florida in Jacksonville area. The nearest stores were, you're talking Miami. Um, and so what I hadn't thought of. I didn't do my homework and due diligence on the fact that our costs were actually significantly more expensive because we had a totally different supplier. In many cases, we had to substitute in certain things, which made it harder to run the store, made it more operationally complex, and it increased the cost. And it was a huge headache. And it was something that I really hadn't thought of. So I think that's a really interesting point to kind of really dive into, or really just to bring up. But it sounds like just one way that people can protect themselves is, you know, do extra homework on if you're looking at a franchise that has less than 50, operating units. And I know that kind of the a big stat in the franchise world is the 100 number, right? With 100 operating franchisees, like only a very small percentage of franchisors make it to that. Um, what do you think is, so if you were to be coaching a franchise buyer, right? Or not coaching, but giving advice, like what would you say? Let's say you were talking to your a family member. They were looking at buying a franchise, and you said, "Hey, you got to do these things in order to do your due diligence properly." Like what would be kind of just like the 1, 2, 3 of that in a simplified version?
Yeah, I think one is I would recommend looking at multiple brands in the same space. Like you said, I think looking at an established brand, an emerging brand, there's a couple benefits to that. One is, typically the established brands can have the proof of concept, but even if you don't go with that established brand, let's say they sold out your whole territory, and so you're going to go with the other ones, it gives you more information about the type of business, and you can see exactly, we talked about item 7 costs. Well, if you have multiple disclosure documents from multiple franchisors, you can look at the costs for like 4 different franchisors in the same space, and that's going to give you a better, number in terms of your costs than you would if you had just one. So I think looking at multiple brands is very important, and not just fixating on one brand at the outset. I think talk to as many franchisees as possible. I think that's so critical. I have clients that talk to zero, and then there's clients that talk to 30, and you want to be more like the client who talked to 30. You want to talk to as many as you can, get a sense of whether they like the franchise system, whether it's working, whether the numbers are accurate. And you're going to, there's stuff that the franchisor can't tell you. The franchisor oftentimes will not put, what the profit margin is of that business or the EBITDA margin of that business, but you might be able to get that from another franchisee or other franchisees in the system. So I think talking to as many franchisees as possible. I think having an attorney to walk through the disclosure document and the agreement's always important too. There might be red flags in those documents, in terms of, hey, this company's been sued for fraud 4 or 5 times, or hey, the whole executive team just left in the last year, and so no one who originally started with this business is there anymore. And so I think it's important either to the the candidate themselves to review the franchise disclosure document, or if they don't want to do it, have an attorney do it for them, because then we can identify any red flags there. And that red flags can lead to more due diligence with the other franchisees of, hey, there's a whole new exec team. Do you like them? Are they good? And, are they terrible? So I think those 3 things, of really reviewing the documents with or without an attorney, talking to a lot of franchisees, and looking at as many brands as possible in the same space will really help them, make an informed decision.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious what you think, like to me, the franchise broker and consulting world is very interesting, for a lack of a better term. And it seems that, a lot of the emerging brands, the reason why people are buying them is because they were shown them or presented them by like a franchise broker or franchise consultant. What percentage of the clients that you're seeing were sold or were presented those brands by brokers versus the clients you're working with that like didn't work with a broker?
Yeah, probably about a quarter work with a broker. Most I think don't. Generally, and we work with a lot of brokers too at the firm. I think the benefit of the brokers, hopefully, they've done some due diligence, either them or the broker group, on that franchise system. But we're also oftentimes educating brokers about, hey, you're promoting this franchise system. I've got 5 people that are suing them. They've got some issues. You may want to think about that. We're not going to tell them not to do it, but we're going to tell them, hey, these are the issues our clients are seeing, and you really might want to think about that before recommending it. And so I think it's also one of the benefits of brokers having a relationship with a law firm or attorneys is kind of we're a little bit of ears to the ground on disputes or systems that are not working as well. And so oftentimes we may have information that I've had brokers who've bought franchises themselves, and they find out that, hey, it's not what it's supposed to be, and they look to us to kind of bring claims. And so even brokers, even though they know this franchising space, oftentimes they can end up in the same situation, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a good point. There was actually a franchise that I was looking at over a year ago now, and it just turns out they didn't have the exact territory I wanted available. It was sold, and I didn't want to be in a territory that wasn't specifically right near my house, and I passed on it. And I hadn't finished with the due diligence, but turns out there were some bombshells that happened at that franchise system and whole class action lawsuits. It was like, whoa, really dodged a bullet there. So yeah, that is a good point that, and that I think that it goes to your point of systems that are growing really fast, where you're not able to get the data points from franchisees quick enough because it just hasn't been proven, kind of enough times. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, on item 19 and being able to navigate that, right? And for anyone listening who doesn't know item 19, it's where franchisors can make financial performance representations and like show how much money they can make. Man, there's a huge variance. I mean, you have some that are just showing average numbers of the quartiles. You have some that list all of every single unit, what the actual sales are. You have some that list the kind of a simplified profit and loss statement for each location. But then there's things like less disclosed expenses. Like, how can someone understand item 19?
Yeah, item 19 is tricky because there's one, it's not even a required disclosure. So it's only probably about two-thirds of franchisors, somewhere around there, that actually include an item 19. And to me, it's a bit of a red flag if they don't, right? If they don't have an item 19, they're not, telling you at least what the revenue of the franchise, Z's or what they've done themselves. To me, that's a little bit concerning. It's not necessarily like don't buy it, because there might be a reason for that. One of the things we see oftentimes is someone selling a franchise system where they have like one or two company owned locations. They put those numbers in item 19, and those numbers are not necessarily good indicators of what a franchisee can expect to earn, because those units might be, like that window company in a hurricane market, right? Or it could have been, hey, they've established this unit for 15 years, and so it's got all this goodwill in the area, and everybody knows them. Or maybe they opened, a fitness boutique, and they're the only, fitness boutique in town, and so they were doing great. So, when you've got one or two units as your barometer in item 19, to me, I look at that with a high degree of skepticism of whether those numbers are going to pan out the same for the franchisees. Now, when you have a lot of units that are accounted for in item 19, then to me, that's a better indicator of what you can expect to earn, because, now that system in year 3, 4, and 5 is incorporating franchisee data into its item 19. So those numbers are likely to be more accurate. But like big picture, I think, for me, if I'm buying a franchise, I think item 19, if they have profits or expenses, that's a real benefit. Obviously, because a franchisee at the end of the day wants to know, how much can I make? And so if those numbers are in the item 19, to me, that's fantastic. That's a really good thing that makes me more likely to want to buy that franchise. If there's just revenue, that's okay. I think then you need to go to franchisees in the system and try to find out, okay, what are the expenses? What does the profit margin look like? And kind of fill in the gaps. And if there's nothing in item 19, to me, that's a bit of a red flag. And unless you can find information from franchisees to suggest that the numbers are very good, I would caution going forward with that brand.
Yeah, so sounds like really great insights. Is there ever, what would you consider a good reason why a franchisor would not have an item 19?
So like, like pizza locations during, COVID, did fantastic, right? A lot of like delivery, pizza places did really well during the pandemic. And so they were faced with a dilemma when they came out of the pandemic of, how do you disclose your numbers? Because the numbers that you had for those pandemic years are arguably inflated compared to what you would expect going forward. So franchisors looked at that in two different ways. One is you include the pandemic data plus the data prior to, so you can kind of show the full picture, or you pull that data. Either of those is like a good legal way to kind of involve the situation, but it might be a reason why you don't see it. The other reason is you might not have the data yet. We talked about that startup franchise system that only has one or two units, and those one or two units might not be indicative of what your franchisee can expect to obtain. So, they might say, well, we've done so well that these numbers aren't going to be really good, you know, reasonable indicators of what a franchisee can expect to make. So we should pull these to be more legally safe. That, I think franchisors will tend to include those numbers almost in every circumstance because they want to sell franchises. But that would be a good reason to pull it out. And then if you talk to the first couple franchisees in the system and they're doing really well, then that might be a reason to go forward with that brand. But it definitely would merit a lot of more due diligence on the numbers.
That's interesting. I never thought about that perspective, that they did so well that it wasn't truly representative, and you wouldn't want to put it in there. Um, yeah, I always think it's interesting when, and some big franchisors, some big ones, don't have item 19s. What is there is there a competitive reason why some of them won't? Like, they don't want their competition to know what they're doing. But I've seen brands that have hundreds, multiple hundreds of franchisees that don't list anything in item 19.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think a lot of the bigger brands, especially on the restaurant side, can be public companies, and oftentimes they have to disclose that information anyway. So probably for them, it's not a competitive benefit. For the private companies, I think, generally either they think the data is not very good that they have, or the numbers aren't that great, or they just think, hey, if we've got a good enough concept, we don't need to sell them with item 19. That we've already proven our concept. That might be the thought process, but generally, I think you franchisors want to include an item 19 if they can.
Yeah, makes sense. And kind of last question we can cap on this, which is what are those scenarios for franchisees that you're really seeing they have the highest likelihood of success in some sort of recourse? Like, I mean, I know we talked about startup costs and stuff like that, but what are you seeing where it's like, hey, yeah, I think in these situations, like we really have a shot of success of really, advocating for you and kind of getting the outcome that you want?
So, what I tell clients is there's really kind of two buckets of claims that we bring. One is a breach of contract, one is fraud. And fraud has their statutes that you can bring claims on that are similar. Breach of contract is tough because typically those franchise agreements are very one-sided agreements. If you kind of look at the fine details, almost all the obligations are on the franchisee. They're not on the franchisor. So just because they provide mediocre marketing or mediocre, support, that's not a breach of contract. Where somebody really has a claim is where there's fraud, which is really, was there something in writing or said orally before you bought the franchise that turned out to be false? And typically we're looking at, numbers, whether the numbers are inaccurate. We're looking at representations as to absentee, semi-absentee. That's a big issue right now. Or, oftentimes it's salespersons that have just said things that are, not accurate. And once you buy the franchise, you find out that's not really the case. So it's really, if people have been told or saw something in writing before they bought the franchise that was false, that's typically where they've got a pretty strong claim to go try to recoup their investment.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. How I guess how many actually go to litigation versus, actually, just, what is it, arbitration? Does it, I guess, what does that look like? Is it just kind of conversations with you and the franchisor and the client? Are they actually going to arbitration? Are they actually going to litigation?
Yeah, so franchisors have an obligation. Once you file a lawsuit, if they settle it for even a penny, the franchisors have an obligation to keep that lawsuit in their disclosure document for 10 years if you have alleged fraud or a violation of a statute. So because of that, they have a pretty good incentive to try to resolve things before litigation is filed. That they keep it out of their disclosure document that way. So probably in about three-fourths of situations, we resolve things without going to litigation or arbitration, just at either conversations with the franchisor and their counsel or a mediation. Most of these franchise agreements require a mediation before you go to any lawsuit, and so oftentimes we're able to resolve it there. And only where the other side's kind of either being stubborn or there's just so much money at issue, then we'll go into litigation and go down that route. But litigation is 2-3 years oftentimes, versus a mediation can happen in a few months. And so there's definitely a benefit to trying to resolve that early if possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Awesome. Before we wrap, anything, any other nuggets or pieces of wisdom that you feel like are important to share or to cap off with?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I'd add is that, we see a lot of people come to us that talk about, hey, I was sold on this being semi-absentee and I kept my job and it's not semi-absentee and I've got to work 50 hours a week at this business. And I think I would be really cautious of any business that has kind of pitches as absentee or semi-absentee. As you know, business ownership is not easy, and especially at the beginning when you're building a business from scratch. It's almost never really an absentee model unless you're talking about maybe like a vending machine or something like that. And so, I really caution people when they look at franchises is that, it's very likely not an absentee model, even if they've sold it as semi-absentee. And really, to make a business work as a business owner, you've got to kind of be all in oftentimes, at the beginning. And at some point in time, after you develop and it works, could you hire a manager and kind of take the pedal off foot off the pedal? Yes, but usually not in that first year or two. And so I caution clients often when they have a full, time W-2 job and they're like, oh, I'll just run this, restaurant business on the side. Like that's not an easy thing to do. And to be really think about whether that's possible or not.
That is such a great point. I'm glad you said that. And one of the things I say to folks is I'd actually prefer that you spend the first year in the business, work it, get it up and running, get the foundation in place, then put a manager in, and then go back to work. But most people do it opposite, where yeah, the more and more I just learn about business. I think it's you if you can go full time right away. I think it's the best scenario. And what's interesting is some of the bigger brands that I see that have very low closure rates, that have maybe multiple brands where they have 1,000 or 1,500 franchisees. Um, they are owner operator models, like some of the daycare brands, and you have companies out there like Winmark that has some of the resale brands, and they're owner operator, and they will not award you a franchise if you don't plan on like being actively in the business. So I think there's something to be said, but everyone wants a shiny object. Everyone wants to get rich quick. Everyone and people selling them this kind of pipe dream overall, which I think is unfortunate. So, but good people like you out there giving great advice and helping, and hopefully no one ever has to meet you on the other side of it. Maybe they'll work with Nancy's side of things on reviewing the FTD, and they do such a good job there that they never interact with you.
That's the hope, that everything goes well. They don't need to give me a call.
Good stuff. Awesome. Well, Doug, thanks for coming on, man. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Hey, before we go, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please subscribe here on YouTube if you haven't already. And the biggest thank you that you could ever give me is to share this episode with someone who you think will benefit. That means that we can share this message with more people and hopefully positively inspire them like we have you. So thank you. And until next time, go build your empire.